The rhythm of Hannah's life had become as predictable as the sunrise itself, her hands already reaching for the milk pail before her eyes had fully adjusted to the darkness of her tiny cabin in southwestern Montana territory, where the year 1883 was proving to be as harsh and unforgiving as the 7 that had come before it, since her parents had died in the fever outbreak. She had been 18 then, thrust into running the small homestead alone with nothing but 30 acres of scrubland, 6 dairy cows, and a stubborn determination that had kept her going through winters that froze the marrow in her bones and summers that baked the earth until it cracked. The town of Copper Ridge lay 3 miles east, close enough to sell her milk and butter, but far enough that the isolation pressed against her like a physical weight most days. The predawn air bit at her cheeks as she crossed the yard toward the barn, her breath forming small clouds that dissipated into the vast darkness overhead. Stars still blazed across the sky, indifferent to her exhaustion, indifferent to the way her shoulders ached from the endless cycle of milking and churning and scrubbing and starting all over again. She was 25 now, and sometimes she caught sight of her reflection in the water bucket and barely recognized the woman staring back with those tired eyes and work-roughened hands. The girls she had known in school were all married with children, their lives unfolding in warm kitchens and shared beds while she rose alone every morning to the patient lowing of cattle who cared nothing for her loneliness. The barn door creaked as she pushed it open, and the familiar smells of hay and animals enveloped her like an old blanket. She had just settled onto the milking stool beside Bess, her gentlest cow, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Her heart kicked against her ribs because visitors before dawn meant nothing good, meant trouble or tragedy or some new hardship the territory had decided to throw at her. She stood quickly, nearly knocking over the empty pail, and moved to the barn door with her father's old rifle in hand, even though she had never actually fired it at another human being, and prayed she never would have to. The rider came into view as the first hints of gray touched the eastern horizon, a tall figure on a rangy paint horse that picked its way carefully across the rocky ground. Hannah recognized him even in the dimness, because everyone in Copper Ridge knew Cole Bridger, the ramrod for the massive Triple R ranch that sprawled across the valley north of town. He was maybe 27 or 28, all lean muscle and quiet intensity, the kind of man who spoke only when he had something worth saying and commanded respect without ever raising his voice. She had seen him in town on occasion, had noticed the way he carried himself with an easy confidence that came from knowing exactly who he was and what he was capable of, but they had never exchanged more than polite nods in passing. "Miss Marston," he called out as he reined in his horse, his voice low and rough like gravel under wagon wheels. "Did not mean to startle you this early." Hannah lowered the rifle slightly but kept it in her hands because caution had kept her alive this long. "Mr. Bridger, something wrong." He swung down from his saddle with the fluid grace of someone who had spent more of his life on horseback than on foot, and she could see his face better now as the light strengthened. He had strong features weathered by sun and wind, dark hair that needed cutting, and eyes that were some indeterminate color between gray and blue. There was something careful in the way he approached, like he was gentling a skittish horse, and she realized with a start that he was trying not to frighten her. "No trouble," he said, stopping a respectful distance away. "I have been riding past your place most mornings on my way to check the north pastures, and I noticed you are out here working before the sun is even thinking about coming up. Seems like hard work for one person to handle alone." Hannah felt her spine straighten defensively because she had been handling it alone for 7 years and did not need anyone pointing out how hard it was. "I manage fine." "I am sure you do," Cole said, and there was no condescension in his tone, just a simple statement of fact. "But I was raised to believe that neighbors help neighbors, and I have got about an hour most mornings before I need to be at the ranch. Figure I could help with the milking, cut your work time in half." She stared at him, trying to parse his meaning, searching for the catch because men did not offer help without wanting something in return. Why would you do that? He was quiet for a long moment, and she watched something shift in his expression, something almost vulnerable that disappeared so quickly she might have imagined it. My mother ran a dairy farm back in Missouri before she passed. I know what that kind of work takes out of a person. And I reckon you could use an extra set of hands. Hannah wanted to refuse because accepting help meant owing someone, meant opening a door she had kept firmly closed since her parents died, and she learned that the only person she could truly rely on was herself. But she was so tired, bone-deep tired in a way that sleep never quite fixed, and the thought of cutting her morning chores in half was tempting enough that she found herself nodding before she could think better of it. I can pay you in milk and butter, she said, because she would not accept charity. Fair enough, Cole agreed easily, and then he was tying his horse to the fence rail and following her into the barn like this was the most natural thing in the world. He proved he had not been lying about knowing his way around a dairy cow, settling onto the stool beside Daisy with practiced ease, and starting a steady rhythm that had milk singing into the pail within moments. They worked in silence at first, the only sounds the swish of milk and the gentle movements of the cows and the slow brightening of the world outside. Hannah kept stealing glances at him, trying to understand this strange turn of events, but he seemed entirely focused on his task with no ulterior motives written on his face. "You have been doing this since your folks passed?" he asked eventually, his voice quiet enough not to spook the animals. 7 years, Hannah confirmed, moving to the next cow in line. They both caught the fever in the winter of '76. By the time I realized how sick they were, it was too late to get a doctor out here. They went within a day of each other. That is hard, Cole said, and the simplicity of the statement somehow meant more than elaborate condolences would have. You have been running this place alone all that time. Did not have much choice. It was this or give up the land and move into town, maybe find work as a seamstress or a laundress. But this land has been in my family since my grandfather homesteaded it back in '68. Seemed wrong to let it go without a fight. I understand that, Cole said. My father spent his whole life working another man's ranch in Missouri, never had anything of his own. He used to say that a man without land is a man without roots, and roots are what keep you standing when the storms come through. I reckon that goes for women too. Hannah felt something in her chest loosen slightly at his words, because he understood in a way most people did not. The townspeople thought she was stubborn and prideful for clinging to this hardscrabble piece of earth, but they did not understand that it was all she had left of her family, of the dreams her grandfather had carried west in a covered wagon, and the sweat her father had poured into every fence post and furrow. They finished the milking as the sun finally broke over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that would have been beautiful if Hannah had not been too exhausted to appreciate them most mornings. But today felt different somehow, the work lighter for being shared, and when Cole carried the full milk pails to the house for her without being asked, she found herself inviting him in for coffee even though she had not had another person in her cabin, since the neighbor woman had come to help lay out her parents' bodies for burial. The cabin was small and sparse but clean, everything in its place because disorder was a luxury she could not afford when every moment of her day was scheduled and accounted for. She poured coffee from the pot she kept warm on the stove and handed him a chipped mug, acutely aware of how shabby everything must look to someone who worked at the Triple R with its grand ranch house and bunkhouses and endless resources. But Cole just cupped the mug in his hands and took a sip, his eyes moving around the room with what looked like approval rather than judgment. You keep a good place, he said. Neat and organized, that matters when you are working alone. Cannot afford to waste time looking for things, Hannah said, settling into the chair across from him. Every minute counts when you have this much work to do. Well, you will have an extra hour every morning now, Cole said. Maybe you can use it to sleep a little longer or work on something else that needs doing around here. Hannah wanted to ask why he was really doing this, what he hoped to gain, but the question felt rude in the face of his steady kindness. So instead she asked, "How long have you been at the Triple R?" "5 years, Cole said. "Came out here from Missouri after my mother passed and there was nothing left keeping me there. Started as a regular ranch hand, worked my way up to Ramrod about 2 years ago. It is good work and Mr. Richardson treats his men fair, but it is not the same as having something of your own." "You want your own place someday?" Hannah asked, hearing the echo of longing in his voice. "That is the plan," Cole admitted. "Been saving every extra dollar I can, looking for the right piece of land to buy. Want something with good water and grass, maybe room for both cattle and a small dairy operation. My mother always said there is good money in dairy if you work it right." They talked for another 20 minutes, the conversation flowing easier than Hannah would have expected, and when Cole finally stood to leave, tipping his hat to her with old-fashioned courtesy, she felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest that she was afraid to name. "Same time tomorrow." He asked from the doorway, his eyes meeting hers with a directness that made her breath catch. "If you are sure," Hannah said, trying to sound casual even though her heart was beating faster than it should. "I am sure," Cole said, and then he was gone, riding off toward the north as the sun climbed higher and Hannah stood in her doorway watching him go, wondering what she had just set in motion. The next morning he was there again, arriving just as she was crossing the yard with her milk pail, and the morning after that. And the one after that until it became a routine she found herself looking forward to with an eagerness that both thrilled and terrified her. They fell into an easy rhythm, working side by side in the peaceful darkness before dawn, talking about everything and nothing while their hands moved through the familiar motions of milking. Hannah learned that Cole had 2 younger sisters back in Missouri who had married farmers and now wrote him letters full of children and crops and the small dramas of rural life. She learned that he had fought in the tail end of the Indian Wars as a young cavalry scout, a fact he shared reluctantly and clearly did not like to dwell on. She learned that he read poetry when he could get his hands on it, which seemed incongruous with his rough exterior, until she realized that Cole Bridger was a man of unexpected depths. He learned that she had wanted to be a teacher before her parents died, that she still read every book she could borrow from the tiny library in Copper Ridge, that she sometimes felt so lonely she talked to the cows just to hear a voice, even if it was her own. He learned that she was afraid of thunderstorms because lightning had struck their barn when she was a child and killed one of their horses, that she made the best buttermilk biscuits in the territory according to her late mother, that she had a sharp wit and a quick laugh when she let her guard down enough to show it. 6 weeks passed in this manner, spring deepening into early summer, the mornings growing warmer and the work becoming easier with 2 sets of hands to share it. Hannah found herself spending more time on her appearance, brushing her honey-colored hair until it shone and wearing her better work dress instead of the patched and faded one she usually favored. She told herself it did not mean anything, that she was just taking more pride in herself, but she knew she was lying even as she thought it. Cole noticed. She could tell by the way his eyes lingered on her face, by the small smile that played at the corners of his mouth when she came out of the cabin in the morning, by the way he found excuses to stand close to her or let their hands brush when they were working. The air between them grew charged with something unspoken, a tension that was not quite comfortable but not entirely unwelcome either. And Hannah knew they were approaching some kind of turning point even if she could not predict what form it would take. The change came on a Tuesday morning in late June when a summer rainstorm blew in unexpectedly, turning the predawn darkness even blacker and sending sheets of water across the yard that soaked them both within seconds. They ran for the barn laughing breathlessly, and once inside they stood dripping and grinning at each other like children who had just gotten away with some harmless mischief. That came out of nowhere, Cole said, pushing wet hair back from his forehead. "Welcome to Montana," Hannah replied, wringing water from her skirt. "If you do not like the weather, wait 5 minutes." They started the milking despite their wet clothes, the cows unbothered by the storm drumming on the roof above them, and Hannah was acutely aware of Cole beside her, of the way his wet shirt clung to his shoulders and the drops of water caught in his dark hair. She was trying to focus on her work when she heard him speak her name, and something in his tone made her look up. "Hannah," he said again, and her name in his rough voice sent shivers down her spine that had nothing to do with her wet clothes. "I need to tell you something, and I have been putting it off because I did not want to make things awkward between us, but I cannot keep quiet anymore." Her hands stilled on the cow's udder, her heart suddenly pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "What is it?" Cole set down his milk pail and stood, moving toward her with that same careful approach he had used the first morning, like she was something precious that might startle and flee. "I did not start coming here just to help with the milking," he said. "I mean, that was part of it, but not the whole truth." "What is the whole truth?" Hannah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The truth is I have been noticing you for near about a year now," Cole said, stopping in front of her. "Every time I saw you in town, I would watch you and think about how strong you must be to keep this place running alone, how determined and capable and beautiful you were even when you looked tired enough to drop. But I figured you would not be interested in a ranch hand with nothing but dreams and a little saved money, so I kept my distance. Then one morning I rode past here and saw you heading into the barn in the dark, and something just snapped inside me. I could not stand the thought of you out here struggling alone when I had 2 good hands and the knowledge to help. So I started coming around, telling myself it was just to help a neighbor, but I was lying to myself." Hannah's breath had caught in her throat, her entire world narrowing down to Cole's face and the words spilling from his lips like a dam had broken. "Lying about what?" "About wanting more than just to help you with your chores," Cole said, and now he was close enough that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his gray eyes, could smell the rain on his skin mixed with leather and horses and something uniquely him. "I want to court you proper, Hannah. Want to come here every morning not just to milk cows, but because it means I get to see your face and hear your voice and spend time with the woman I am falling in love with. But if you do not feel the same, if I have been reading this all wrong, just say the word and I will go back to being nothing but a helpful neighbor and never mention it again." Hannah's mind was racing, her heart doing acrobatics in her chest, because Cole Bridger had just said he was falling in love with her, and she needed to find words to respond, but every thought had scattered like startled birds. She had spent 7 years building walls around her heart, telling herself she did not need anyone, that she was better off alone where no one could hurt her or leave her the way everyone she had ever loved had left. But Cole had been quietly dismantling those walls brick by brick every morning for 6 weeks, and she realized with stunning clarity that she had been falling in love with him too. So gradually, she had not even noticed until this moment when he was standing in front of her with his heart in his hands. "You have not been reading it wrong," she managed finally, her voice shaking. "I have been trying not to feel this way because I was afraid, because I have been alone so long I forgot what it was like to want someone near. But I do want you near, Cole. I want you here every morning and every evening and all the times in between. I think I have been falling in love with you too, and it terrifies me because I do not know how to do this anymore." The smile that broke across Cole's face was like sunrise, bright and warm and full of promise, and then he was reaching for her hands, pulling her to her feet and holding her like she was something infinitely valuable. "We will figure it out together," he said softly. "That is what people do when they care about each other. They figure things out together." And then he was kissing her, gentle at first and then deeper as she wound her arms around his neck and kissed him back with 7 years of loneliness and longing pouring out of her. The cows shifted and lowed around them, patient and unimpressed by this human drama, and the rain continued to drum on the roof above while Hannah and Cole stood in the sweet-smelling hay and discovered what it felt like to be less alone. They courted properly after that, though it was complicated by the fact that they lived 3 miles apart and both had demanding work schedules that left little time for traditional socializing. But Cole started staying for breakfast after the morning milking, and Hannah would pack him extra biscuits and bacon to take to the ranch for his midday meal. He came back in the evenings when he could, helping her with repairs around the homestead and the endless other tasks that accumulated when you ran a place alone. They took a picnic to the creek on Sunday afternoons when the Triple R could spare him, spreading a blanket under the cottonwood trees and talking for hours about their hopes and dreams and the life they might build together. Because that was where this was heading, Hannah knew, toward a future that included both of them instead of two separate lonely people struggling along their individual paths. Cole talked about his plans to buy land, but now those plans included her homestead adjoining his future property, creating something larger and more viable than either of them could manage alone. Hannah talked about expanding the dairy operation, maybe getting some chickens and pigs as well, building something sustainable that could support a family if they were careful and worked hard. The word family had hung in the air between them after she said it, weighted with possibility, and Cole had pulled her close and kissed her hair and said, "I want that with you, Hannah. Want to build a life and a home and maybe fill it with children someday if we are blessed that way. Want to wake up next to you every morning instead of riding 3 miles in the dark just to see your face." That sounds like a proposal, Cole Bridger, Hannah had teased, even though her heart was racing with hope and joy and a little bit of fear because wanting something this much meant it had the power to hurt her if it went wrong. "Not yet," Cole had said seriously. "When I propose, I want to do it right. Want to have a ring and some kind of future secured and be able to promise you more than just hard work and uncertainty. But it is coming, Hannah. That is a promise." True to his word, Cole started making concrete plans. He spoke to Mr. Richardson about buying a parcel of Triple R land that adjoined Hannah's property. 500 acres of good grazing land with a creek running through it that the ranch was willing to sell at a fair price to a trusted employee. He had been saving for 5 years and had enough for a down payment, with an agreement to pay the rest over time as his own herd grew and became profitable. The deal was struck in late July, papers signed and filed with the land office in town, and suddenly Cole was not just a ranch hand anymore but a landowner with a stake in his own future. He proposed on a Saturday evening in August, riding up to Hannah's cabin with his hat in his hands and nervous energy radiating from him like heat from a stove. She had been weeding her small vegetable garden, dirt under her fingernails and sweat on her brow, looking nothing like a woman who was about to receive a proposal of marriage. But Cole knelt right there in the dirt beside her and pulled a simple gold band from his pocket, his gray-blue eyes meeting hers with such love and sincerity that tears immediately sprang to her eyes. "Hannah Marston," he said, his rough voice steady despite the nerves she could see in the set of his shoulders. "I am not a man of fancy words or grand gestures, and I cannot promise you an easy life because ranching and dairy farming are hard work that never stops. But I can promise you that I will love you with everything I have, that I will work beside you every day to build something lasting, that I will never leave you to face the world alone again. Will you marry me and let me spend the rest of my life proving that I am worthy of the gift that would be?" Hannah was crying openly now, not bothering to wipe away the tears that streamed down her cheeks because they were happy tears, the kind she had not cried since before her parents died. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking on the word. "Yes, Cole, I will marry you. I love you, and I want to build that life with you. Want to wake up beside you every morning and go to sleep beside you every night and face whatever comes knowing we are facing it together." Cole slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly like it had been made for her, even though she knew he had just guessed at the size. Then he was pulling her into his arms and kissing her with a passion that made her head spin and her knees weak. And when they finally broke apart, they were both laughing and crying at the same time, giddy with joy and the relief of having said out loud what they had both been feeling for months. They were married 6 weeks later in the small church in Copper Ridge, a simple ceremony attended by ranch hands from the Triple R and a handful of townspeople who had known Hannah all her life. She wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in a trunk and still beautiful despite being 27 years old, the ivory lace and satin making her feel connected to the parents she had lost and the new family she was forming. Cole wore his best suit, looking handsome and slightly uncomfortable in the formal clothes, his eyes never leaving her face as she walked down the aisle without anyone to give her away, because she was giving herself, freely and completely, to this man who had seen her at her most exhausted and isolated and had chosen to love her anyway. The vows they spoke were traditional, the same words countless couples had spoken before them, but when Cole said, "I do," his voice was fierce with conviction, and when Hannah promised to love and honor him for the rest of her days, she meant it with every fiber of her being. The kiss they shared after the minister pronounced them man and wife was chaste compared to the passionate embraces they had shared in private, but it was no less meaningful, sealing the promise they had made to each other in front of God and community. The celebration afterward was held at the hotel dining room, Mr. Richardson having generously paid for a meal for all the guests as a wedding gift to his ramrod. There was roasted beef and potatoes and fresh bread, apple pie and strong coffee, fiddle music and dancing that went on into the evening. Hannah danced with her new husband, his hand strong and steady at her waist, and felt like she was floating on air despite the practical work boots under her dress. Cole kept leaning down to whisper in her ear, things like, "You are the most beautiful woman I have ever seen," and "I cannot believe I get to take you home with me," that made her blush and laugh and fall even more deeply in love with this good man who had appeared in her barnyard one predawn morning and changed everything. They spent their wedding night in the hotel's best room, another gift from Mr. Richardson, and Hannah experienced for the first time what it meant to be truly intimate with another person, to give yourself completely and receive the same in return. Cole was gentle and patient, aware that this was all new to her, and by the time the sun rose the next morning she understood in a whole new way what it meant to be married, to be truly joined to another person in body and heart and soul. They moved into Hannah's cabin at first because it was already established with furniture and a working farm around it, though it was cramped for 2 people after years of housing only one. Cole brought his few possessions from the bunkhouse at the Triple R, clothes and books and the tools of his trade, and they rearranged the small space to accommodate them both. He continued working at the Triple R for wages, while building up his own herd on the land he had purchased, buying a dozen head of good breeding stock and turning them out on the grassy acres that would become their future ranch. Hannah continued running her dairy operation, but now the morning milking was always a shared task, the two of them working side by side as the sun came up and talking about their plans for the day ahead. It was not always easy. They had disagreements about how to spend their limited money, about whether to invest in more cows or save for a new barn, about 100 small decisions that came with merging 2 independent lives into one shared existence. But they learned to talk through their differences, to compromise and find solutions that honored both their perspectives, and every conflict resolved made their partnership stronger. Hannah discovered she was pregnant in March of 1884, about 6 months after their wedding, and the joy on Cole's face when she told him was something she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. He placed his hand on her still flat belly with wonder, his eyes bright with unshed tears, and said, "We made a baby. We are going to be parents. Hannah, you have just made me the happiest man in Montana Territory." The pregnancy was hard, as pregnancies on the frontier often were, with morning sickness that lasted well into the afternoon and exhaustion that made every task feel monumental. But Cole took over more of the heavy work, insisting she rest when she needed to and not push herself beyond what was safe for her and the baby. He was attentive and worried, fussing over her in ways that would have annoyed her if they had not been so clearly rooted in love and concern. Their son was born in November during an early snowstorm, brought into the world by the same midwife who had delivered half the babies in Copper Ridge over the past 20 years. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Hannah was sure she could not endure another contraction, could not find the strength to push again. But Cole was there beside her the whole time, holding her hand and wiping her forehead and telling her she was strong enough to do this. And when their son finally slipped into the world with a healthy cry, Hannah sobbed with relief and joy, and a love so intense it almost frightened her. They named him Thomas after Cole's father, and from the moment Hannah held him against her chest, she knew she would do anything to protect this tiny, perfect human they had created. He had dark hair like his father and gray eyes that would eventually turn the same blue-gray as Cole's, and he fit into their lives like he had always been meant to be there. Cole proved to be a natural father, patient and tender with his son in ways that made Hannah love him even more, waking in the night to change diapers and walking the floor with Thomas when he was fussy so Hannah could rest. The years rolled forward, marked by the rhythms of farm life and the growing family that filled their cabin to bursting. Hannah got pregnant again when Thomas was 18 months old, and this time she carried a daughter they named Sarah after Hannah's mother. 2 years after that came another son, Michael, and then a gap of 3 years before their youngest, Emma, arrived as a surprise when Hannah had thought they were done having children. By 1890, Cole had saved enough to start building a proper house on his land. A solid 2-story structure with 4 bedrooms and a real parlor and a kitchen big enough to accommodate their growing family. They built it slowly over 2 years, Cole and hired men from the RRR working on it whenever time and money allowed. And when they finally moved in during the summer of 1892, Hannah wept as she crossed the threshold of her new home. It was everything she had dreamed of during those long, lonely years, when she thought she would live and die in that tiny cabin, without ever knowing what it felt like to have a real family and a real future. The dairy operation had expanded to 20 cows, and they had built a proper dairy barn with modern equipment that made the work easier and more efficient. Cole's cattle herd had grown to over 200 head, and they employed 2 ranch hands year-round to help with the work. The combined operations were profitable enough to support the family comfortably, not wealthy by any means but secure in a way that would have seemed impossible to the lonely woman Hannah had been before Cole appeared in her barnyard. The children grew like weeds, Thomas becoming a serious boy who loved working with the cattle alongside his father, Sarah inheriting her mother's head for numbers and helping keep the farm accounts once she was old enough, Michael the charmer who could talk anyone into anything, and Emma the baby who had everyone wrapped around her tiny finger. The house was always full of noise and chaos and laughter, so different from the silent cabin where Hannah had spent those 7 years alone that sometimes she had to stop and just look around in wonder at how much her life had changed. Cole never did become a man of many words, but he showed his love in 1,000 small ways every day. The way he still woke early to help with the morning milking even though they could afford to hire someone to do it. The way he brought her wildflowers from the pastures in the summer and held her close by the fire in the winter. The way he looked at her across a crowded room like she was still the only woman in the world worth seeing. The way he was patient and kind with their children, teaching them to work hard but also to find joy in simple things. Hannah had learned to bake those buttermilk biscuits her mother had been famous for, and she made them every Sunday morning, the kitchen filled with the smell of fresh bread and coffee while the family gathered around the big table Cole had built with his own hands. These were the moments she treasured most, all of them together and healthy and safe. The children bickering and laughing and Cole catching her eye with a smile that said he was thinking the same thing she was. We made this, we built this life together from nothing but hard work and determination and love. Thomas turned 18 in November of 1902, the same age Hannah had been when her parents died, and she inherited a struggling homestead and a future that looked bleak and lonely. But Thomas's 18th birthday was a celebration, the house full of friends and neighbors, his whole life stretching before him full of possibilities, because he had parents who loved him and land that would be his someday and the education and opportunities his grandparents had crossed the country to find. Sarah was 16 and already being courted by the son of a neighboring rancher, a good young man who looked at her the way Cole still looked at Hannah after 19 years of marriage. Michael was 14 and more interested in horses than anything else, spending every spare moment in the barn or out riding the range. Emma was 11 and already showing signs of the stubborn independence that had allowed her mother to survive those hard years alone. Cole had turned 42 that year, still strong and capable but with silver threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. Hannah was 43, her hands still were cruffined, but now adorned with the gold band Cole had given her, and a few more rings he had surprised her with over the years. They were not young anymore, but they were happy in a deep settled way that young love could not quite achieve, their relationship tempered and strengthened by nearly 2 decades of facing life together. One morning in late spring of 1903, Hannah woke before dawn out of old habit and found Cole already awake beside her, his gray-blue eyes watching her in the dimness. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly, not wanting to wake the children sleeping in the other rooms. "Just remembering the first morning I came to help you with the milking," Cole said, reaching over to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "How nervous I was that you would send me away, how much I already cared about you even though we had barely spoken. I was so sure you would think I was crazy or presume something inappropriate, but I could not stop myself from trying." Hannah smiled, covering his hand with hers. "I almost did send you away. I was so used to being alone, so convinced I did not need anyone. Thank God I was tired enough to accept your help, or I might have missed out on all of this." "I would have kept trying," Cole said with certainty. "Would have found some other excuse to come around until you finally gave me a chance. I knew from the first time I really looked at you that you were going to be important to me, even if I could not have said exactly how." "We should go milk the cows," Hannah said, even though they had hired hands who did most of that work now. "Like we used to, just the two of us." Cole's face lit up with understanding and pleasure, and they dressed quietly and slipped out of the house while their children slept, walking across the yard to the dairy barn through the predawn darkness that was so familiar it felt like coming home. The cows greeted them with patient lowing, unconcerned about who was doing the milking as long as it got done, and Hannah and Cole settled onto the stools in companionable silence. The rhythm came back immediately, muscle memory from thousands of mornings spent this way, and Hannah felt herself relaxing into the familiar motions. This was where it had all started, in a barn at dawn with a man who had seen her struggling alone and decided to help for no reason except that it was the right thing to do. That simple act of kindness had changed both their lives completely, had led to love and marriage and children and a thriving ranch that provided for them all. "I love you," Hannah said into the quiet, the words as true now as they had been the first time she said them nearly 20 years ago. "I love you for coming to help me that first morning, for seeing me when I felt invisible, for building this life with me. You saved me, Cole, not just from the hard work, but from a loneliness that was eating me alive." Cole looked over at her, his hands stilling on the cow's udder, and the expression on his face was so tender it made her throat tighten with emotion. "You saved me too," he said. I was drifting before I met you, working for wages and saving for a future that felt like it would never come. You gave me a purpose beyond just surviving, a reason to build something lasting. You gave me everything that matters, Hannah. Everything." They finished the milking as the sun rose, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and orange. And then they walked back to the house hand in hand to find their children starting to wake and the day beginning in earnest. There would be breakfast to make and chores to complete, and 1,000 small tasks that came with running a working ranch. There would be challenges ahead, because life always brought challenges, but they would face them together the way they had faced everything else for the past 19 years. That evening after supper, the whole family gathered in the parlor as they often did. Thomas was reading aloud from a book about cattle breeding while Sarah worked on her embroidery, and Michael whittled a piece of wood into some shape only he could envision. Emma sat at her mother's feet playing with a rag doll, and Cole had his arm around Hannah's shoulders as they sat together on the settee they had bought when they moved into this house. Hannah looked around at her family, at the home they had built, at the life that had grown from those early morning milking sessions when a lonely woman and a determined cowboy had started falling in love over dairy cows and dawn light. It was not the life she had imagined for herself when she was 18 and newly orphaned, sure that her future held nothing but hard work and isolation. It was so much better than anything she could have dreamed. "Mama, tell us the story about how you and Papa met," Emma said suddenly, looking up with those gray-blue eyes so like her father's. Hannah smiled and glanced at Cole, who grinned back at her with the easy affection of long marriage. "Well," she began, as their other children set aside their activities to listen because they never tired of this story. "I was milking cows before dawn every morning, working myself to exhaustion trying to keep the farm running alone. And then one morning a cowboy rode up out of the darkness and told me he wanted to help, for no reason except that he thought I needed it. And he started waking early just to help her," Cole continued, picking up the narrative as he always did. "Even though he had his own work to do and no good reason to add more to his day, except that he had noticed this beautiful, stubborn woman who refused to give up no matter how hard things got, and he wanted to know her better. But it was not really about the milking, was it, Papa?" Thomas asked, though he knew the answer because they had heard this story dozens of times. "No," Cole agreed, his arm tightening around Hannah. "It was never really about the milking. It was about finding someone worth waking up early for, worth changing your whole life for. It was about love, even before I was ready to call it that." Emma sighed with satisfaction, and Sarah smiled over her embroidery, and the boys exchanged the tolerant looks of young men who thought themselves too old for romance stories, but secretly still enjoyed them. Hannah leaned into Cole's solid warmth and felt gratitude wash over her, deep and profound, for the morning he had ridden into her life and refused to ride back out. The years continued to unfold, marked by weddings and grandchildren and the slow, graceful aging that came with a life well lived. Thomas married and brought his bride to live on a portion of the ranch, building his own house and starting his own herd while still working alongside his father. Sarah wed her rancher's son and moved to the neighboring property, close enough to visit often. Michael eventually bought a string of horses and started a breeding operation that became quite successful. Emma married later, a teacher from back east who had come west looking for adventure and found it in a rancher's daughter with her mother's stubborn independence. Cole and Hannah grew old together, their hair going white and their steps slowing but their love remaining as steady and true as it had been in those early days when they were just learning each other. They still helped with the morning milking sometimes, though their children and grandchildren did most of the work now, because those quiet hours before dawn had always been their special time, when it was just the two of them and the patient cows and the slowly brightening sky. On a morning in early spring of 1926, 43 years after that first dawn when Cole had ridden into Hannah's barnyard, they made their way to the dairy barn one last time together. Cole was 65 now, his body finally starting to show the wear of a lifetime of hard physical labor, and Hannah was 64, her hands twisted with arthritis, but still capable of the work she had been doing since she was 18. They milked in comfortable silence, the rhythm as familiar as breathing, and when they finished, Cole helped Hannah to her feet and pulled her into his arms right there in the barn the way he had done on that rainy morning so many years ago, when he had finally confessed his feelings. "Best decision I ever made," he said into her white hair, "was waking up early to help you milk these cows." "Best decision I ever made was letting you," Hannah replied, her voice still strong despite her age. "I love you, Cole Bridger. I have loved you for more than 4 decades, and I will love you for whatever time we have left. And beyond that," Cole said, "I will love you beyond that into whatever comes after this life. You are mine and I am yours forever and always." They walked back to the house as the sun rose, just as they had done thousands of times before, their hands clasped together and their hearts full. Behind them, the dairy barn stood solid and well-maintained, full of cows that would need milking again tomorrow. Around them, the ranch spread in all directions, hundreds of acres that they had built from nothing through determination and hard work, and the simple choice to help each other. Ahead of them, the house waited, full of the sounds and smells of family gathering for breakfast. It was an ordinary morning in an ordinary life, except that it was extraordinary in all the ways that mattered. Because 43 years earlier, a lonely woman had been milking cows before dawn, and a cowboy had started waking early just to help her. And from that simple beginning had grown a love story that would echo through generations of their family. A reminder that the greatest adventures often start with the smallest acts of kindness, and that the right person appearing at the right moment can change everything.